In the halls of justice, where impartiality should reign supreme, one judge made a fatal mistake that would cost him his career and reputation. It was a humid Tuesday morning in the Westlake County Courthouse when Judge Richard Mercer, known for his stern demeanor and unforgiving rulings, encountered someone he never should have crossed. Comment where you're watching from today as we dive into a story about power, justice, and what happens when those who enforce the law forget they're not above it. The Westlake County Courthouse stood as an imposing marble structure, its classical columns reaching toward the sky like rigid fingers of authority. The building had witnessed countless verdicts over its century-long existence, but few as shocking as what would unfold on that fateful day. Inside, the polished wooden benches gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the American flag hung motionless beside the judge's bench. The courtroom smelled of leather-bound law books and the faint scent of lemon polish, creating an atmosphere of solemn reverence. Among those filing into courtroom 3 that morning was Elizabeth Hackman, a woman whose understated elegance didn't immediately reveal her lineage. Her tailored navy suit and minimalist jewelry spoke of quiet confidence rather than ostentation. With her father's distinct jawline and penetrating gaze, Elizabeth carried herself with the same dignity that had made Gene Hackman a Hollywood legend. She wasn't there seeking special treatment, quite the opposite. As an environmental attorney representing a local conservation group, she wanted nothing more than a fair hearing for her clients who were challenging a development project with significant ecological implications. Judge Richard Mercer entered the courtroom with the swift, purposeful stride that had become his trademark. At 68, his silver hair and penetrating blue eyes gave him the appearance of wisdom, though many who had stood before him would argue that his wisdom had long ago surrendered to arrogance. He had been on the bench for nearly 3 decades, and the power had settled into his bones like calcium, hardening him against the humanity that appeared before him daily. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. The assemblage of attorneys, clients, and observers stood in unison as Mercer took his seat, adjusting his robes with an almost theatrical flourish. "Be seated," he commanded, barely looking up from the docket before him. His gaze scanned the room, pausing momentarily on Elizabeth before moving on. There was something in that glance, a flicker of disdain perhaps, or simple indifference, that foreshadowed the conflict to come. The proceedings began with routine matters, but when Elizabeth's case was called, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted subtly. She approached the podium with measured steps, her case files organized with meticulous precision. "Your Honor, Elizabeth Hackman, representing the Westlake Environmental Coalition," she began, her voice clear and steady. "We're here today seeking an injunction against Meridian Development's planned construction at Cedar Lake, as outlined in our brief." Judge Mercer's expression hardened as he leaned forward. "Ms. Hackman, I've reviewed your brief. It seems to me you're asking this court to halt a multi-million-dollar project based on speculation about some frogs and birds." Elizabeth maintained her composure. "With respect, Your Honor, our petition is supported by extensive environmental impact studies conducted by state-certified ecologists. The wetlands at Cedar Lake represent a critical habitat for several endangered species, protected under federal law." Yes, Mercer interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Everyone's an environmentalist these days. Meridian has all their permits in order. What exactly do you expect this court to do? Halt progress for the sake of sentimentality?" The attorney for Meridian Development, James Wilson, a slick corporate lawyer with an expensive suit and practiced smile, couldn't suppress a smirk at the judge's obvious leaning. Elizabeth noticed, but remained undeterred. "Your Honor, we're not opposing development on principle. We're asking for compliance with existing environmental protection statutes. Meridian's own initial surveys acknowledged the presence of protected species, but failed to implement the required mitigation measures." Judge Mercer sighed dramatically, making no effort to hide his impatience. "Ms. Hackman, this court's time is valuable. More valuable, I dare say, than hypothetical concerns about wildlife that can simply relocate." Elizabeth's expression remained professional, but her eyes betrayed a flash of indignation. "The law doesn't consider these concerns hypothetical, Your Honor. The Endangered Species Act specifically—" "I'm quite familiar with the law, Ms. Hackman," Mercer cut in, his voice taking on an edge that silenced the courtroom. What I'm not familiar with is why an attorney of your limited experience thinks she can lecture this court on statutory interpretation. The insult hung in the air, its intention clear to everyone present. Elizabeth took a deep breath before responding. I apologize if I gave that impression, Your Honor. I was merely establishing the legal basis for our petition. Judge Mercer leaned back, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I wonder, Ms. Hackman, if you'd have taken this case at all if your name wasn't what it is. Do environmental groups typically seek out the children of celebrities, hoping for some reflected notoriety? Or was this a special arrangement? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elizabeth stood perfectly still, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the podium. The opposing counsel looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as the judge's comments ventured far beyond the bounds of judicial propriety. Your Honor, Elizabeth began, her voice steady despite the flush rising to her cheeks. My parentage has no bearing on the merits of this case or my qualifications to argue it. I graduated summa cum laude from Yale Law and have practiced environmental law for 12 years. Mercer's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yes, I'm sure your path has been paved with all sorts of advantages, Miss Hackman. Must be nice to have doors open simply because of who your father is. Tell me, does he still remember his lines, or has age taken that from him too? The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Elizabeth's colleague, seated at the table behind her, half rose in protest before thinking better of it. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above her stenotype machine, as if uncertain whether such remarks should be entered into the official record. Elizabeth stood perfectly still, dignity intact despite the public humiliation. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried to every corner of the hushed room. Your Honor, I respectfully request that we focus on the legal matters before the court. Something in her composure seemed to further irritate Mercer. Perhaps it was her refusal to be baited, or perhaps it was something deeper, a resentment toward what he perceived as privilege, or simply the frustration of a man who had grown accustomed to seeing others crumble before his authority. Request noted, he said coldly. Request denied. Motion for injunction is dismissed. This court will not entertain frivolous attempts to hinder economic development. He banged his gavel with unnecessary force. Next case. Elizabeth gathered her documents, her movements deliberate and controlled. Those watching might have thought her resigned to defeat, but those who knew her, truly knew her, would have recognized the glint in her eye. It wasn't submission they were witnessing, but the calm calculation of someone who had just identified their opponent's fatal weakness. As she exited the courtroom, Elizabeth didn't head for the building's main entrance. Instead, she took a different turn, walking purposefully toward an office marked Court Administration. Her phone was already in her hand. Her father's number, not the one she was dialing, but rather another contact, one that would set in motion events Judge Richard Mercer could never have anticipated. The wheels of justice sometimes turn slowly, but on that day, they were about to spin with unexpected speed. And for a judge who had forgotten the true meaning of his oath, a harsh lesson in accountability was only minutes away. The Westlake County Courthouse was a place where whispers traveled faster than sound. By the time Elizabeth Hackman reached the court administration office, the exchange between her and Judge Mercer had already become the talk of the building. Clerks exchanged meaningful glances as she passed, and a bailiff from another courtroom offered a sympathetic nod. The courthouse had seen Judge Mercer's temperament deteriorate over the years, but today's display had crossed a line that even his most loyal defenders would find difficult to justify. Elizabeth wasn't seeking sympathy, however. Her purposeful stride carried her directly to the office of Judith Wilson, the court administrator, a woman whose 30 years of service had earned her both respect and significant influence within the judicial system. The brass nameplate on her door gleamed in the fluorescent light as Elizabeth knocked firmly. "Come in," called a voice from within. Judith Wilson sat behind a desk covered with meticulously organized files, her silver-framed glasses perched on the edge of her nose. At 65, she had the appearance of someone who had seen every trick, heard every excuse, and maintained her professional integrity through it all. She looked up from her computer screen, recognition flickering across her face. "Ms. Hackman," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, "I've been expecting you." Elizabeth closed the door behind her before taking the offered seat. You've heard, then. The walls in this courthouse are thinner than Judge Mercer's patience, Judith replied, removing her glasses, but I'd prefer to hear your account directly. For the next 10 minutes, Elizabeth recounted the exchange in courtroom 3 with precise detail, her legal training evident in the clarity of her narrative. She neither embellished nor downplayed the judge's remarks, simply presenting them as they had occurred. Throughout her account, Judith's expression remained carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed a deepening concern. This isn't the first complaint about Judge Mercer's conduct, Judith said when Elizabeth had finished, but it may be the most egregious. I'm not here to file a complaint about his rudeness, Elizabeth clarified. I'm here because what transpired goes beyond incivility. Judge Mercer demonstrated clear bias and made his ruling based on personal prejudice rather than legal merit. Judith nodded slowly. And you believe this warrants more than a formal reprimand? I believe it warrants recusal from all my cases at minimum, Elizabeth replied, but more importantly, I believe it reveals a pattern of behavior that the Judicial Conduct Committee should investigate. As they spoke, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with an incoming text. She glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to Judith. I've taken the liberty of contacting Robert Chen from the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. He's been monitoring Judge Mercer's courtroom conduct for the past year. Judith's eyebrows rose slightly. That's unusually proactive of you. My father taught me something valuable long before I became an attorney, Elizabeth said, a hint of steel entering her voice. He said, in this world, there are 3 types of people: those who are intimidated by power, those who abuse power, and those who hold power accountable. I've chosen my category. Outside the administrator's office, the courthouse continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the wheels being set in motion behind closed doors. Judge Mercer had returned to his chambers after completing his morning docket, his mood no better than when he had dismissed Elizabeth's case. His clerk, Marcus Alvarez, approached his door with trepidation, a stack of documents requiring the judge's signature in his hands. What is it now, Marcus? Mercer snapped when the young man entered. Just some orders that need your signature, Your Honor, Marcus replied, placing the files on the judge's desk. Mercer snatched a pen from his drawer and began signing without reviewing the documents, his movements sharp with irritation. That Hackman woman, he muttered, another entitled celebrity offspring thinking the world owes her special treatment. Marcus remained silent, having learned long ago that engaging with the judge during these moods only prolonged them. What Judge Mercer didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Marcus had been one of Robert Chen's confidential informants for months, documenting the judge's increasingly erratic and biased behavior. Across town, in the sleek offices of the State Bar Association, Robert Chen was reviewing a file labeled Mercer, Richard J. Judicial Conduct Investigation. The folder had grown thick over the past year, filled with sworn statements from attorneys, court personnel, and even other judges who had witnessed Mercer's declining professionalism. Chen's phone rang, displaying Elizabeth Hackman's name. Ms. Hackman, he answered. I've just received the audio transcript from this morning's proceedings. It's illuminating. Then you understand the urgency, Elizabeth replied, her voice calm but resolute. Indeed, the Chief Justice has already been notified. We're convening an emergency session of the Judicial Conduct Committee this afternoon. Will you be available to testify? I'll clear my schedule, Elizabeth confirmed. Back at the courthouse, Judge Mercer was preparing for his afternoon session, unaware that his morning's conduct had accelerated an investigation that had been quietly building momentum for months. He straightened his robe before his private bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar with practiced precision. The face that looked back at him showed no signs of remorse or self-reflection, only the hardened confidence of a man who had grown comfortable wielding power without accountability. As Mercer emerged from his chambers, he was surprised to find Chief Justice Eleanor Reynolds waiting in the corridor. At 72, Reynolds commanded respect, not through intimidation, but through her unwavering commitment to judicial integrity. Her presence in the courthouse was unusual. As head of the state Supreme Court, her visits to lower courts were typically scheduled well in advance for ceremonial purposes. Eleanor, Mercer said, his surprise evident in his voice. "This is unexpected." "Richard," she replied, her tone professionally cordial but lacking warmth. "May I have a word in your chambers?" Inside, with the door closed, Chief Justice Reynolds didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've received a recording of your exchange with Elizabeth Hackman this morning." Mercer's expression darkened. "Court recordings are confidential without a proper request protocol." "This came through proper channels, I assure you," Reynolds replied. "The Judicial Conduct Committee has been monitoring your courtroom for some time." "Monitoring?" Mercer's voice rose in indignation. "On what grounds?" "Initially, on the grounds of multiple complaints about your temperament," Reynolds explained. "But what I heard today goes far beyond mere incivility. You made your ruling based on personal bias against an attorney because of her family connections, not on the merits of the case." Mercer scoffed. "I made my ruling based on the law, Eleanor. If Ms. Hackman feels otherwise, she's welcome to appeal." "She's done more than that," Reynolds said, placing a document on his desk. "This is an order for your immediate recusal from all cases involving Ms. Hackman or her firm, pending a full investigation by the committee." Mercer's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. One privileged attorney throws a tantrum because she didn't get her way, and suddenly I'm under investigation?" Chief Justice Reynolds fixed him with a steady gaze. "This isn't about one incident, Richard. It's about a pattern. Your comments this morning were merely the tipping point." As they spoke, Elizabeth had returned to her law firm's offices, where her colleagues had gathered in the conference room, concern evident on their faces. Her managing partner, David Schultz, approached her as she entered. "We heard what happened," he said. "The firm stands with you completely. Judge Mercer's behavior was inexcusable." Elizabeth nodded her appreciation. "It wasn't just unprofessional. It revealed a fundamental bias that calls into question every ruling he's made in similar cases." "What's your next step?" David asked. "The Judicial Conduct Committee is meeting this afternoon," Elizabeth explained. "But there's more at stake here than my personal dignity or even our current case. There's a systemic issue that needs addressing." While Elizabeth briefed her colleagues, Judge Mercer was facing the reality that his actions had triggered a process he could not control. In his chambers, after Chief Justice Reynolds had departed, he paced furiously, occasionally stopping to glare at the recusal order on his desk. His judicial assistant knocked tentatively on the door. "Your Honor, there's a Detective Ramirez here to see you." Mercer frowned. "I don't have any appointments with law enforcement today." "He says it's urgent, Your Honor." Detective Carlos Ramirez entered Judge Mercer's chambers with the measured confidence of someone who had confronted power before and remained unimpressed by it. His badge gleamed on his belt, partially covered by his tailored suit jacket. "Judge Mercer," he began, his tone professionally detached, "I'm here regarding a complaint that's been filed against you." Mercer's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion. "Complaint? What kind of complaint requires police involvement?" "A serious one," Ramirez replied. "We've received documentation of multiple instances where you've used your position to intimidate and discriminate against attorneys based on factors unrelated to their cases. This morning's incident with Ms. Hackman is just the most recent example." "That's preposterous," Mercer sputtered. "Whatever Ms. Hackman told you." "This isn't just about Ms. Hackman," Ramirez interrupted. "We've been gathering evidence for months. Court reporters, bailiffs, clerks, and attorneys have all provided sworn statements." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Mercer's face. "Evidence of what, exactly?" "Judicial misconduct, witness intimidation, and abuse of power," Ramirez stated flatly. "There's also the matter of certain financial irregularities that have come to light during our investigation." "Financial irregularities?" Mercer repeated, his voice suddenly hoarse. "What are you implying?" Detective Ramirez removed a document from his jacket pocket. "We have a warrant to search your financial records, Judge Mercer. There appear to be some concerning correlations between your rulings in certain corporate cases and deposits made to an offshore account linked to your brother-in-law's consulting firm." The color drained from Mercer's face. The offshore account had been his wife's idea, a place to store the consulting fees that occasionally came his way after favorable rulings in high-stakes corporate litigation. It was supposed to be untraceable, a perfect system that had operated smoothly for years. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "A misunderstanding." "Perhaps," Ramirez acknowledged, "but given the serious nature of these allegations, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the station for questioning." Outside Judge Mercer's chambers, court staff gathered in hushed groups, watching as Detective Ramirez escorted the judge through the hallway. The sight of the once feared jurist, now pale and shaken, being led away created a tableau that would be seared into the institutional memory of the courthouse for years to come. Elizabeth Hackman, arriving at the Judicial Conduct Committee hearing, was informed of the developments by Robert Chen. "It seems your complaint was the catalyst for something much larger," he explained. "The police had been building a case against Judge Mercer for corruption, but they needed a clear example of bias that couldn't be explained away as judicial discretion." Elizabeth took a moment to process this information. "So this wasn't just about his behavior toward me?" "No," Chen confirmed. "Your experience was the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel a much larger tapestry of misconduct. The question now is whether you're prepared for what comes next. This will likely become a high-profile case, and your name, and by extension, your father's, will be associated with it." Elizabeth's response was immediate and resolute. "Justice isn't a spectator sport, Mr. Chen. I'm prepared for whatever comes next." As the Judicial Conduct Committee convened, with Elizabeth prepared to testify about her experience, Judge Richard Mercer was being processed at the police station, his fingerprints taken, his mugshot, capturing the stunned disbelief of a man who had never expected to find himself on the other side of the justice system he had administered with such callous disregard for so long. In the span of mere hours, a routine court appearance had transformed into a watershed moment for the Westlake County judicial system. And it had all begun with a judge who had made the fatal mistake of insulting not just any attorney, but one who understood that true justice required not just the courage to speak truth to power, but the persistence to ensure that power was held accountable. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the Westlake County Police Station, casting long shadows across the interview room where Judge Richard Mercer sat rigid in his chair. The once imposing figure of judicial authority now appeared diminished, his silver hair disheveled, his eyes darting nervously as Detective Ramirez arranged a series of documents on the metal table between them. The recording device blinked steadily, capturing every word, every shifting expression in what would become one of the most significant corruption investigations in the county's history. "For the record," Ramirez began, his voice calm and methodical, "this is Detective Carlos Ramirez interviewing Judge Richard Mercer regarding case number JC 2023-42. Judge Mercer has been advised of his rights and has declined legal representation at this time." Mercer's jaw tightened. "I don't need a lawyer because I haven't done anything wrong. This is a misunderstanding that we can clear up quickly." Detective Ramirez nodded without comment, then slid a bank statement across the table. "Can you explain these deposits to Oceanic Ventures Limited, a company registered in the Cayman Islands, to your brother-in-law, William Harrington?" "Bill runs a legitimate international consulting business," Mercer replied, his tone defensive. "His clients value their privacy. There's nothing illegal about that. And it's merely coincidental that these deposits occurred within days of your rulings in favor of Meridian Development, Atlantic Pharmaceutical, and Westland Mining," Ramirez countered, his finger tapping each corporate name on a separate document. Mercer's eyes narrowed. "I make my rulings based on the law, Detective. If you're suggesting otherwise, you're on dangerous ground." "What's dangerous, Judge Mercer, is the appearance that justice in your courtroom was for sale," Ramirez responded, his voice still even. "We have witness testimony from your former clerk describing how you would signal your readiness to receive consulting fees through specific phrases used during certain hearings." For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Mercer's face. Marcus Alvarez, his clerk of 3 years, had always seemed so loyal, so eager to please. The realization that the young man had been documenting his actions sent a chill through him. Meanwhile, across town, the Judicial Conduct Committee hearing had commenced in a somber conference room at the State Bar Association. 5 distinguished judges and attorneys sat behind a long table, their expressions grave, as Elizabeth Hackman recounted her experience in Judge Mercer's courtroom that morning. And then he said, Must be nice to have doors open simply because of who your father is. Tell me, does he still remember his lines, or has age taken that from him too? Elizabeth concluded, her voice steady despite the indignity of the memory. Judge Amara Johnson, chair of the committee, leaned forward. Ms. Hackman, in your professional opinion, did Judge Mercer's personal comments influence his ruling on your motion? Without question, Elizabeth replied, he dismissed our petition without addressing any of the substantive legal arguments presented. His ruling was based on his apparent bias against me personally, not on the merits of the case. Robert Chen approached the committee table with a thick folder. Members of the committee, we've compiled statements from 17 attorneys who have appeared before Judge Mercer in the past 18 months. 14 report experiencing similar bias, though none as overt as today's incident. What's particularly troubling is the pattern that emerges when we analyze the outcomes. Chen distributed charts showing a stark correlation. Attorneys who were women, minorities, or from smaller firms were significantly more likely to receive unfavorable rulings regardless of case type or legal precedent. This statistical analysis, combined with today's incident and the ongoing criminal investigation, paints a disturbing picture of a judge who has betrayed his oath in multiple ways, Chen concluded. As the committee deliberated, news of Judge Mercer's detention had spread throughout the legal community. At Elizabeth's law firm, her colleagues gathered around television screens watching breaking news reports. In a stunning development, long-serving Judge Richard Mercer was taken into police custody today following allegations of judicial misconduct and possible corruption, the reporter announced, standing on the courthouse steps. Sources close to the investigation suggest that financial records reveal suspicious transactions coinciding with favorable rulings in several high-profile cases. David Schultz turned to Elizabeth as she returned to the office. You've started an earthquake in the justice system. Are you prepared for the aftershocks? Elizabeth's expression remained resolute. This isn't about starting something, David. It's about ending something, a culture of impunity that's corrupted our courts for too long. Back at the police station, Detective Ramirez had been joined by Assistant District Attorney Linda Park, a prosecutor known for her relentless pursuit of public corruption cases. Her presence signaled the seriousness with which the district attorney's office was treating the allegations. Judge Mercer, Park began, her tone precise and measured, we're prepared to offer consideration if you're willing to provide information about other judges or attorneys involved in similar arrangements. Mercer's face flushed with indignation. You're asking me to fabricate accusations against my colleagues to save myself? Absolutely not. I'm asking for the truth, Park corrected him. Your financial records tell part of the story, but we believe this extends beyond you. The system of favors, the network of influence, it doesn't exist in isolation. As this confrontation unfolded, Chief Justice Reynolds had convened an emergency meeting with the presiding judges of the county court system. The normally imposing conference room felt charged with tension as she addressed her colleagues. The integrity of our entire judiciary is now under scrutiny, she said, her voice grave. Judge Mercer's actions have cast a shadow over all of us. We must be proactive and transparent in our response. Judge William Haskins, a contemporary of Mercer's, cleared his throat. Eleanor, aren't we being hasty? These are allegations, not proven facts. Richard deserves due process. As does every person who has appeared in his courtroom, Reynolds countered, which is why I've ordered a review of all significant rulings made by Judge Mercer over the past 5 years, particularly in cases involving the corporations named in the investigation. The announcement sent a ripple of concern through the assembled judges. A comprehensive review would be unprecedented, potentially opening the door to appeals and retrials in dozens, if not hundreds, of cases. At that same moment, Elizabeth was on the phone with her father, the conversation private despite the bustling activity around her at the firm. Dad, I didn't do this because of your name, she explained. I did it because it was right. Jean Hackman's voice came through the line, deep and reassuring as it had been throughout her life. I know that, Lizzie. You've always had a stronger sense of justice than most. Your mother and I are proud of you, not for standing up to a bully, but for standing up for what's right. The conversation provided a moment of personal connection amidst the whirlwind of public events she had catalyzed. When she ended the call, Elizabeth found herself face-to-face with reporter Sophia Chen, from the Westlake Tribune. Ms. Hackman, can we get a statement about Judge Mercer's arrest and the role your complaint played in triggering the investigation? Chen asked, recorder in hand. Elizabeth considered her response carefully. This isn't about a personal grievance. It's about upholding the fundamental principle that justice must be impartial. When a judge allows personal bias to influence their rulings, it undermines the very foundation of our legal system. As evening approached, the various strands of the day's events began to converge. The Judicial Conduct Committee emerged from their deliberations with a unanimous recommendation for Judge Mercer's immediate suspension, pending the outcome of both their investigation and the criminal proceedings. Chief Justice Reynolds, upon receiving their recommendation, issued the formal order without hesitation. At the police station, after hours of questioning, Judge Richard Mercer was formally charged with multiple counts of bribery, corruption, and abuse of office. His mugshot, capturing the haggard face of a man confronting the consequences of his actions, would appear on news websites within the hour. For Elizabeth Hackman, the day that had begun with a routine court appearance had transformed into a pivotal moment in her career and in the administration of justice in Westlake County. As she reviewed the emergency motion her team had prepared to reopen their environmental case, she reflected on how a single act of standing firm against injustice had uncovered a web of corruption that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, would continue to turn. And for Judge Richard Mercer, the man who had sat in judgment of others for decades, the ultimate judgment was still to come. The morning newspapers arrived on doorsteps throughout Westlake County, with headlines that would have seemed unimaginable just days before. Judge behind bars, Mercer faces. 32 counts of corruption dominated the front page of the Tribune, accompanied by the now infamous mugshot that captured the fallen judge's stunned expression. For many citizens, the news came as a shock. For others who had stood before Judge Mercer's bench over the years, it represented long-delayed accountability. The Westlake County Courthouse operated with an unusual atmosphere as attorneys, staff, and citizens navigated the ripple effects of Mercer's arrest. Court calendars were in disarray as cases had to be reassigned, and a temporary judge, Honorable Maria Gonzalez, had been appointed to handle Mercer's docket. The hallways buzzed with speculation about how far the corruption investigation would reach and which powerful figures might next find themselves under scrutiny. Elizabeth Hackman arrived at the courthouse that morning with her team, ready for the rehearing of the Cedar Lake environmental case that had been granted on an emergency basis by the Chief Justice. The same courtroom where Judge Mercer had dismissed her case with contempt now felt markedly different under Judge Gonzalez's calm, attentive presence. The court has reviewed the environmental impact studies and supporting documentation, Judge Gonzalez stated after hearing arguments from both sides. Based on the evidence presented, the injunction against Meridian Development's Cedar Lake project is granted pending full environmental compliance verification by state authorities. James Wilson, the attorney for Meridian Development who had smirked during Elizabeth's previous appearance, now appeared subdued. The corporate developer's legal position had been severely weakened, not just by the merits of the case, but by emerging evidence that company executives had been among those making consulting payments to Judge Mercer's offshore accounts. As Elizabeth gathered her documents after the successful hearing, a court clerk approached her. Ms. Hackman, the Chief Justice has requested a brief meeting with you in her chambers, if you're available. Chief Justice Reynolds was reviewing documents when Elizabeth entered her office, looking up with a smile that conveyed both warmth and respect. Ms. Hackman, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. I wanted to personally thank you for your courage. Your willingness to stand firm in the face of Judge Mercer's inappropriate behavior opened the door to uncovering corruption that might have continued for years otherwise. Elizabeth nodded her acknowledgement. I appreciate that, Your Honor, but I can't take credit for the broader investigation. I was simply doing what any attorney should do when faced with obvious judicial bias. Yet many don't, Reynolds observed. Fear of retaliation or concern for future cases often silences those who witness misconduct, which brings me to the reason I asked to speak with you. She slid a folder across the desk. The governor has asked me to recommend candidates for a new Ethics Compliance Commission to review judicial conduct throughout the state. Your name is at the top of my list if you're interested. Elizabeth opened the folder, scanning the overview of the proposed commission. This is significant. A complete overhaul of how judicial complaints are handled. The Mercer case exposed vulnerabilities in our system, Reynolds explained. We need people with your integrity to help rebuild public trust. As Elizabeth considered this unexpected opportunity, across town at the district attorney's office, Assistant DA Linda Park was meeting with Detective Ramirez to review the expanding investigation. Spread across the conference table were financial records, court transcripts, and witness statements connecting Judge Mercer to a network of influence that extended far beyond his courtroom. We've identified 7 corporations that made regular payments to Mercer through various shell companies, Ramirez explained, pointing to a complex diagram on the whiteboard. But what's more concerning is this. He indicated lines connecting 3 other judges in neighboring counties to the same network. How solid is the evidence against the other judges? Park asked, her expression grave. Solid enough for search warrants, which are being executed as we speak, Ramirez confirmed. This is becoming the largest judicial corruption case in state history. Meanwhile, at the county jail, Judge Richard Mercer sat in an isolated cell, a special accommodation made due to the sensitive nature of his position and the hundreds of criminals he had sentenced over the years. His attorney, Gregory Patel, one of the most expensive defense lawyers in the state, was reviewing the mounting evidence against his client. Richard, I need to be candid with you, Patel said, his voice low. The prosecution has a remarkably strong case. The financial records alone are damning, but now they have cooperating witnesses, including your former clerk and at least 2 corporate executives who are testifying in exchange for leniency. Mercer stared at the wall, his composure finally cracking. How did it unravel so quickly? One moment I'm on the bench, the next I'm here. He gestured at the cell around him. It was the Hackman incident, Patel replied matter-of-factly. Your comments to her were so egregiously inappropriate that they couldn't be explained away as judicial temperament. It gave investigators the opening they needed to execute search warrants they've been building a case for. Without that incident, they might have spent months gathering more evidence before moving against you. The irony wasn't lost on Mercer. His contempt for Elizabeth Hackman, a woman he had dismissed as trading on her father's fame, had been the catalyst for his downfall. In reality, it was her own competence, integrity, and courage that had exposed him, not her famous lineage. At the State Bar Association, Robert Chen was briefing a room full of reporters on the preliminary findings of the Judicial Conduct Committee's investigation. Our review has identified 28 cases over the past 3 years where Judge Mercer's rulings showed statistically significant bias correlating with financial benefits to himself or related parties, Chen explained. We're recommending that these cases be reopened for new hearings before different judges. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Chen, is it true that Judge Mercer's inappropriate behavior toward Elizabeth Hackman, daughter of actor Gene Hackman, was what triggered this entire investigation? Chen considered his response carefully. Ms. Hackman's experience was certainly a tipping point, but she was one of many attorneys who had documented Judge Mercer's inappropriate conduct. What made her action significant was her immediate decision to pursue every available remedy, rather than simply accepting the bias as an unfortunate reality of our system. As the press conference continued, Elizabeth was having dinner with her parents at their home, a rare moment of privacy amidst the media storm that had erupted around the case. Gene Hackman, still imposing despite his years, listened with pride as his daughter described the day's developments. It's going to be a long process, Elizabeth explained, but the Ethics Compliance Commission has the potential to create real systemic change in how we monitor judicial conduct. I've played judges in films, Gene remarked with a wry smile, but I always tried to portray them as the guardians of justice they're supposed to be, not what Mercer became. What he chose to become, Elizabeth corrected gently. Every day, judges face the choice between using their power with integrity or abusing it. Most choose integrity. The following morning, Elizabeth arrived at her law firm to find her colleagues gathered in the conference room, applauding as she entered. David Schultz approached with a newspaper in hand, folded to show an editorial titled "Integrity in Action: How One Attorney's Stand Exposed Judicial Corruption." "You've become the symbol of what our profession should aspire to," David said, handing her the paper, "and not because of your last name, but because of who you are." Elizabeth accepted the paper with a modest smile. This was never about one judge or one case. It's about a principle that's bigger than all of us, that justice must not only be fair, but be seen to be fair. When we tolerate bias or corruption in our courts, we undermine the very foundation of our legal system. As she spoke, across town, Judge Mercer was being led from the county jail to a transport vehicle that would take him to his arraignment. The man who had once commanded a courtroom with arrogance now shuffled in handcuffs, his future to be decided by the very system he had corrupted. For Elizabeth Hackman, the daughter of a man who had portrayed justice on screen, the opportunity to help restore justice in reality represented a profound responsibility. The case that had begun with a judge's petty insult had evolved into a watershed moment for judicial accountability in Westlake County and beyond. In the end, it wasn't Elizabeth's famous name that had made the difference. It was her unwavering commitment to the principles that her father had only portrayed. And in that commitment, she had demonstrated a truth more powerful than any fiction, that a single person, standing firmly for what is right, can set in motion changes that transform an entire system. Justice, long delayed for many who had suffered under Judge Mercer's biased rulings, was finally being served.